I'm indeed very happy to see all of you. It's a very important index of the finally picking up appreciation of the tremendously rapidly moving energy situation. Now, it's a situation that is fraught with danger and that also has great opportunities. Later on today, it will be my pleasure, I think it's during the lunch hour, to show you a film that we began to make. It's about energy, documentary film about solar energy. And just to indicate to you how things change, when it was finished a few months ago, 6 months ago, the part of the public broadcasting system, National Public Broadcasting System, saw an almost finished version of it and said, we like that film, we'd like to show it. Then they said a few details we need to discuss with you. Well, eventually I got a letter from them, and the first detail that I noticed they wanted to discuss with us, not really discuss with us, they wanted us to eliminate it, was the remark that in context, and you will see that remark, hear that remark in the film, that we have become addicted to fossil fuels. And they said that has to be eliminated, that's alarmist. But a few days ago, I saw it right at the beginning of the energy part of the President's State of the Union address. Right, the exactly same words. It's even possible he got it from our film. Because we had our premiere in Washington in September, I think, and we distributed about 200 copies of the DVD all over, and some of them must have gotten to the White House. So I like to think we had an influence. In any case, it is really very heartening to me that so many of you have come to this meeting. It's a very important time, and I am not going to worry to alarm you people, but it is urgent. You heard yesterday that oil is running out. There's some debate as to exactly when, but it's running out before the middle of the century. That's tomorrow, and that is an enormous infrastructure, and to turn that around is just an enormous challenge. And this is not the kind of thing that you can say, oh, well, we still have enough, and then, hey, tomorrow it's gone. What I've seen, the projection that I've seen from the U.S. Department of Energy, which I personally think is somewhat exaggerated, but nevertheless, there it is. It shows a peak. They don't quite know when it will occur. 2026 is the earliest estimate. 2047 is the latest estimate. And when that peak has arrived, they show energy production dropping by a factor of 2 in approximately every 10 years. Can you even imagine that scenario? We better get ready for that, and get ready for it quickly. So thank you for coming. I look forward to this meeting. I look forward to some good ideas being generated, and we do have here a wide spectrum of people, from people in economics down to or up to, depending on your viewpoint, people doing the purest science. Thank you very much.
My role as Dean to shine a spotlight on UCSB and particularly the College of Engineering in the context of this Concept to Commerce conference, with the underlying belief that a lot of these problems are not going to be brought to a successful solution unless a business can be generated that really can be successful in delivering a product that society really votes for by buying it. And as is mentioned in the notes, over 30% of the College of Engineering faculty over the last decade or so has engaged in the act of entrepreneurship in some way. Not always successfully, but certainly intending to be successful, and most importantly, trying to take the steps that are necessary to do what Walter was saying a few minutes ago, take things out of the basic university research labs and bring them to society. That's really what we're talking about here. And I want to do this in the context of another thing that's going on our campus, which is the expected opening in April of 2006 of the building that you see when you come right off 217 onto the campus, the California Nanosystems Institute, because I think, as has been mentioned in several ways, starting at least implicitly with some of the things that Klaus Lackner was talking about yesterday, certainly with Howard Burke and Ted Sargent and others today, a lot of the basic solutions to some of the energy problems will come out of small-scale technology. And I don't get too wrapped up in what nanotechnology really means. Extreme miniaturization is a good enough terminology for me. If you want to think about it in a little more profound way, you would start to think of the scale of things that are bigger than atoms and molecules that start to have functional utility as systems. And then, of course, there's the overlap with biology, which does things at the nanoscale. So the protein molecule that has so many functions is a nanoscale object built up from atoms, but only by one order of magnitude or so. And so that's where there's an awful lot of exciting convergence between biology and nanotechnology that I think can be brought to bear on these problems, and we've already been talking about it. So at UCSB, we're trying to position ourselves to continue to lead in this area. This building, as I said, we expect to open in April, and it's going to provide a broadly enabling interdisciplinary environment that we intend to use principally for collaborative labs of multi-investigator projects. We want to create new laboratory environments that bring these things together, and of course with state-of-the-art capabilities. This is all being done in the context, too, of a national nanotechnology initiative in the United States, which is putting close to $1 billion over this decade into this kind of small-scale research. So this investment, by the way, that the state of California has made on our behalf, a $100 million gift to establish the CNSI, the California Nanosystems Institute, split roughly equally between UCLA and UC Santa Barbara, is what is really positioning us to do this. Just as a kind of point before I get into the applications and business outputs, over the last 5 years, this is a partial, although it's all the ones I could think of. I'm saying it's partial because I'm pretty sure there might be some that I couldn't think of nanotechnology-related grants that have been awarded to UCSB with some kind of umbrella of the California Nanosystems Institute, either using that as some of the housing for the project or the grants and contracts apparatus. And if you just look at the names of things, these grants range from imaging to bioinformatics to biotechnology, quantum information science, medical therapies for cancer and heart disease, and the Center for Nanoscience Innovation and Defense, as well as a social science research institute that's beginning to explore some of the implications of nanotechnology for society. So this has enabled already a major investment, largely of federal and some private resources in UCSB to position us to do this. It's also part of the National Nanofabrication Infrastructure Network. I have a mislabel there. The user should be infrastructure. The UCSB is one of 13 institutions. It was one of the original 5, and in a new incarnation now there are 13 institutions that provide an integrated network of user facilities supported by the National Science Foundation to do this. So in this context, I don't want to dwell on this, but we have over 200 outside users per month of these nanofabrication facilities in our current facilities. And as the new building opens, this is going to expand into the bio-nanofabrication area. So I want you to know that the state and the country and the campus are making big investments to try to position ourselves to do this. There are dozens of companies that have come out of this nanofabrication environment. Over the last couple of years, I'm going to highlight just a few. One is based on gallium nitride, wide bandgap semiconductor solid-state lighting, where UCSB has led U.S. academic development. In the 90s, attracting Shuji Nakamura here in the year 2000 continues to lead, was responsible for the startup of a company that in various incarnations was known as Nitrous, and now is Cree Lighting here in Santa Barbara. This one relates directly to energy efficiency, and this solid-state energy center here will continue, I think, to be a source of new technologies and new companies. But again, the areas are diverse. It's not all electronic material. Some of this is for micro machining, and Noel McDonald, along with collaborators Dan Blumenthal and John Bowers, have looked at MEMS for optical switching. This micro mirror technology was transferred to Caliant Corporation, which produces optical switching for telecommunications. Evelyn Hu and a former co-worker of hers from here, Angie Belcher, who worked with several faculty members here, have recently started a company called Cambrios that is really at this convergence between bio and nanotechnology, using programmed biological templates for self-assembled interconnects in nanoelectronic circuits. And maybe the most recent one that I want to highlight comes out of microfluidic research driven by Tom So in our mechanical engineering department that is aimed at cell sorting, which is going to be extremely important in cancer therapy, in stem cell therapy, and many others. So they have some very creative ways of separating out specialized cells from a diverse population of cells using this dielectrophoresis technique, and have just started a company called Cytomics here in Santa Barbara to exploit this technology. To finish up, I don't think I have done as good a job in this list as some other people have done already in mentioning certain things about how nanotechnology will have impacts on energy. It'll certainly have impacts in all of the areas you could think of about energy: conversion or generation, storage, transmission, and conservation and efficiency, in particular with new materials development, porous materials development. Batteries are really totally inadequate, as has been mentioned. There's going to be an interesting thing play out between whether distributed local generation or transmission is the way that energy is distributed. In either case, nanotechnology will play some role in the local generation or in the transmission lines with nanowires, superconductors, and so on. And then the solid-state lighting example that I mentioned. So these are things I wanted to draw your attention to about local impacts in this area, and many of the faculty are here, so I hope you'll have a chance to talk with them.
Rough rule of thumb: the world will consume roughly 10 times as much energy as today if the rest of the world were to catch up with the US and Canada and countries like that. So there is an enormous challenge there where we will go, because these countries will go up there, and of course we are trying to bend this curve down, and in many ways it is bending down. We are getting better every year by about 1.5%. And if you look at the business as usual projections, they already have that built in. So we can't double count that. We will get a lot of efficiency, but by itself it will not solve the problem. Another sort of theme I heard a lot here is, well, these renewables will win in the end because the fossil fuels in particular will simply run out on us. That is true at some level. We probably will run out of oil in the foreseeable future, but even that at some level is debatable. But I would like to point out, this is a scale coming out of a paper by Rochner some years ago in 1997, where he puts the total reserves at nearly 1,700 gigatons of oil equivalent, and you should compare that to about 300, which have already been consumed over the last 200 years. So that sets the scale. The rate at which it is being consumed right now is 7.5. So in many ways, this resource is very large. If you look at this is the proven reserves in some sense. If you go one step further and say how big is the resource base, he estimates that it is on the order of 5,000 gigatons. And to add to this is that fossil fuels are very much interchangeable. They are fungible. If you look at South Africa, South Africa was successful when it was embargoed to make synthetic fuels from coal at a price which was like $45 a barrel. And I'm a harmless engineer when it comes to these things. If you take those 3 plants and you replicate them to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, and that's the kind of number you would need for world consumption, prices will come down. So while I think we have to go to renewables, and I'll come in a second to why there's a big problem, don't think this will happen with a competition which simply lies down and falls over. It is quite likely that from a resource base over the next 100 years, fossil fuels will not be terribly much more expensive than they are today, because their resource is fantastically large. And so you can envision a counter to what we were talking here a lot, that we are going to make synthesis gas, and we are making that from natural gas all the way down to coal. And we have a fantastically large resource which can then make you all the conventional fuels and then some, and of course it can provide heat and it can provide electricity. Now, let me go to the problem. The problem, of course, is that the environmental impacts of doing this will be very, very large. What I have done here, I took a simple model, which is a phenomenological model, which says how much the ocean will pick up CO2, and I fitted this to the exponential growth we roughly had over the last 200 years, and with only 2 fitting parameters, namely how much we consume by the year 2000, and what the growth rate is, which comes out to be that the characteristic growth time is about 44 years. I fitted this to the observed data, so I want to tell you this, even though it's a very simple-minded model, it actually captures pretty well what happened. Now let me move that forward. Some mix-up here, apologize. Let me move that forward for a second and say we keep going on that exponential growth, and you can see there on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, how high the CO2 in the air would get. And you see even by the year 2100, we have reached 1200 ppm. So it would get fantastically large. Now what I am showing you here, that some miracle happens. We better our way, and in the year 2010, we are holding emissions constant, which is the curve labeled 100%. So what you see then, things will keep going up if we simply hold emissions constant. This is a stock problem. This is not a flow problem. We have to reduce things. So by how much? The curve 33% says the same miracle happened in 2010, but we managed to drive emissions down by a factor 3. CO2 in the atmosphere will keep going up. If we drop it down to 10% of current emissions, it will indeed drop for a while, and then gradually it will creep up again. Only if we stopped completely, things would stop. So the fossil fuel sector will be stuck in a situation where eventually it will have to deal with this. And now I apologize, and I'm trying to give you this backwards. What I show you here, this red circle which is labeled 1, is 100 years of current emissions for put basically the next century if we don't grow. 2 is 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Your guess is as good as mine how much we would do under business as usual if we don't put our house in order. But the overall number is very large, and I compare this against the backdrop of possible resource sizes. We will not run out this century, but if we put 180 ppm into the air on top of where we are, we cover that much of this circle. If we were to go 30% of the ocean acidified by a pH change of 0.3, which by the way will wipe out coral reefs, this is how much we could cover. If we figure out how to put 50% more biomass in the world, which I don't know how we would do, this is how much we would cover, and a 30% increase in soil carbon would cover that much. So the bottom line is, if we grow on the trajectory we are likely to grow, there is no way that we can hide that carbon in the natural places. It's simply, there is not enough room. And to give you a perspective, when people tell you you already know that we have a problem, this is what we have done between 1800 and 2000. There's a little bit here in the corner which pops up there. This is the exponential growth, and the dangers of that. So we have a severe mismatch between the sources and the sinks, and we will have to deal with this. Now, what I have already said, there are lots of options, and we talked about them, and some of them are large and some of them are not. If the world were to live on wind energy alone, we would severely change the climate simply by using wind. The US consumes enough energy. If that came from wind today, we would every day stop all the wind over an area the size of New Mexico, every day. So quite clearly, we would start seeing impacts if the world would do 4 or 5 times as much as that. Right now, we are only doing 1% of it, so it's not a big problem. If you look at all the energy in ocean waves, in ocean currents and ocean tides, it is less power which is fanning these phenomena than the world is consuming right now. So even if we stopped it all dead in its tracks, we didn't have the energy we are consuming right now. So there are limits to all of that. And similarly to biomass, if we grow enough biomass to make our cars run on, and even with grossly increased efficiency, we will compete dramatically against food production, and food production will have to grow over the next 100 years as well dramatically. So there are limits. I would argue there's a triad of large-scale options which are backed by a multitude of other opportunities. I don't want to tell you you shouldn't do wind. Quite the contrary. I think it's a very good idea. I'm just telling you, at the end of the day, you will need other options. Solar is one of them, but you have to have a drastic reduction in cost. Nuclear is one, and I don't think we can put this off the table. I agree with Jim Boyden on that. It is an important thing to think about. There are cost issues. Is it simply too expensive right now? There are waste issues we haven't resolved yet. There are safety issues. We had accidents in the past, and we need to be better than that. And there are security issues dealing with the proliferation issues. But we can't wipe it off the table and say this is not one of the options we have. And ultimately, we have to look at the fossil energy. There are 5,000 gigatons of carbon left, and my suspicion is we will use it anyhow because it's so cheap. So we have to figure out how to do it in a way so that we don't harm the environment, and that means zero emission. Does not just mean zero emission in the conventional pollutants, but it also means zero emission in carbon. So it requires carbon storage, and in order to deal with the oil shortages which will come, we need to have a way of converting from one form of fossil energy into the other and make that more acceptable and cheaper. So this is the challenge we have in front of us. I would argue you need to work on wind and efficiency and all of these things. They are important, and they may be, from a venture capital, from a venture point of view, from an entrepreneur's point of view, the immediately best option. But if none of these 3 big items will make it because we failed, and all 3 of them could still fail, we will have a severe energy crisis by the end of the century, probably earlier than that. If any one of those makes it, we have the assurance that we will have plenty of energy. And in that sense, I think we really cannot neglect these big 3, and we'll have to look at it. And let me just put a word in there on complications with the hydrogen economy. I know we don't have any hydrogen wells, so we can't just mine it. We have to make it, and we have to make it with energy. And I will argue, for the foreseeable future, that energy is not going to be electricity. And in order to show you this, what I have done here is I have given you, in this red bar here, you see here, the price range these have traded in, and I put the purple on because over the last few years, over the last year or two, prices have really shot up. So what you see in these ranges is the typical cost, the price ranges per a fixed unit of energy, and I have chosen the gigajoule. And the precise numbers don't really matter for this, but my point is, on this scale, 5 cents a kilowatt hour is $14 a gigajoule, while a ton of coal is approximately $1 a gigajoule. So coal is so much cheaper that I would argue that is the likely place where your hydrogen is coming from. Hydrogen is a carrier like electricity. And just like electricity, it is so different from its parent that it really doesn't care anymore what the parent was. It will go for the cheapest energy it can find, and that used to be natural gas, and is likely for a long time to be coal. So only if the prices of electricity, for example photovoltaic electricity, have come dramatically down to maybe a penny a kilowatt hour, will you see large-scale production of hydrogen from that source. The competition of using fossil is very, very large. So, because I don't terribly much know about nuclear energy and solar energy, and you know probably more about it than I do, I prefer to talk a little bit about the fossil fuel side to give you a feeling what it would take to do that. You would have to invent a net zero carbon economy, which means you have to collect all of your CO2 from the concentrated sources. You have to possibly figure out how to collect CO2 back from the air, which is an alternative to getting it at the source. But once you have that CO2 in hand, you have to dispose of it safely and permanently. And I think the only options there in the short term are to inject it underground, and in the long term to chemically bind it as a limestone-like equivalent as a carbonate. Both of those things can be done. The first one can be done today in an affordable fashion. The second one would require further work. But I tell you why this is so important, because in a sense, you can say what limits us in the carbon arena is not the resource base. What limits us is the CO2 emission allowance. And if we were willing to go to doubling, which I don't think we can stop anyhow earlier than that, we have about 900 gigatons of carbon in the total. 300 of those, that's what I labeled here as past, is already gone. And then what you see after that going around here in a clockwise fashion are 10 years at current growth rate, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and we have consumed all of that if we keep going like we do right now. So that's the limit we will hit sometime in the middle of the century. If we figure out how to remove the carbon constraint, the picture changes to that. And that's why I think it's so important to actually do that. So how do you go about it? I already said you can inject underground. I don't want to say much more about that. It's actually cost effective. To give you a feeling for the other issue, you actually do a chemical reaction. You say carbonic acid, carbon dioxide is actually carbonic acid if you bring it together with water. It forms a salt, and it forms a salt with magnesium. It even is a reaction which generates a slight bit of energy. Now we don't have that right now. And the real challenge is that this happens in nature in 100,000 years. And we would like to do it in 30 minutes. We are working on that. We are making progress on it, but I don't think we are quite there yet. Right now, the process has been estimated to cost $80 per ton of CO2. We have to get it down below 30 is my guess. My point here is this is a lot closer than, for example, fuel cells are. So this, from an entrepreneurial point of view, is a little far out. There still needs basic research, but eventually it will get there. There is plenty of resource. California, as a matter of fact, a friend of mine, a geologist, called this serpentine sort of the state rock of California, and it is that magnesium silicate we were just talking about. There is plenty of it worldwide. Once you have a way of putting the CO2 away, you still have to get it. And the obvious thing is you scrub your flue stack and you get it out there. But in the long term, you don't want to do that. In the long term, you want to cap that stack in order to get everything else out. And capturing the CO2 has one of those funny synergies which actually makes that possible. And the way it makes that possible is that if you didn't let the CO2 out and you didn't bring in nitrogen from the air, what is it you really brought in? You brought in some water, you brought in some coal, you combusted it with oxygen, and all you made are condensables because you collected the CO2 to put it away. So you can literally design power plants, and you have heard about this here, which have no smokestack, and they collect all of their emissions and put them away underground safely and permanently. So this is a whole set of technologies. Here's a particular one we have been working on where you take carbon and you react it with CO2 to make CO. You run that through a fuel cell. Yes, fuel cells can do other things than combust hydrogen. In this case, it combusts CO. And you take the two CO2 which come out and throw one away and recycle the other one, and the heat from the fuel cell runs the gasifier on the other side. So there are ways of doing this to get to extremely efficient power plants, 70% efficient we have estimated for this particular one, and at the same time collect all of your CO2 and have zero emissions to the atmosphere. But let me give you a brief discussion, and this is a television picture, so this is not real. This is a what-if scenario where you actually collect the CO2 back from the atmosphere. Assume that you can scrub it, and you can do with strong sorbents like a sodium hydroxide, which would get in contact with the CO2 in the air and literally absorb it out. And we have done this experiment. You may actually have done this in high school when you were a kid, because it's a common experiment to show that lime water or sodium hydroxide does absorb CO2 out of the air. And so the challenge now is to get that CO2 back off there. We have estimates that we can drive the price of this ultimately down to maybe $30 a ton of CO2. If we succeed in this, this opens all sorts of interesting doors. What it does is, among other things, it lets you drive a car and collect the CO2 after the fact, because you cannot store all that CO2 on board of a vehicle because there's not enough room for that. How big would these units have to be? And let me tell you here, this was a surprise for me when I worked this out too. You know that a person in the US is responsible for the consumption of 10 kilowatt of power. Every second, 10,000 joules. If I want a windmill in a good area where you have 6 meter per second wind, you would need 80 square meter, which is a big barn door for you personally to absolve you of CO2 emissions, because you now have your energy from a personal windmill. The scrubber, which would see the equal amount of CO2 blowing through the air, is 0.2 square meter or 2 square feet. It is 400 times smaller. And that's why I'm optimistic that a technology like that can actually be built. Now, if you pretend that the cost of a windmill would be the same as the cost of the air scrubber in the operating per hour per area, it would only cost you 50 cents to collect the ton of CO2. What that tells you is it's the scrubbers are not what's costing you the money. It's the processing afterwards. And we figured we can get that for about $30 a ton. By the way, the side corollary here is the cost will not be terribly much different than in a power plant, because that step of recovering your sorbent is actually not that much different. So just like you now have seen materially closed energy cycles, with the hydrogen economy, where you basically collect water in the environment, you use your energy source to split it up into hydrogen and oxygen, which you release, and the consumer recreates the water. We can now, with air extraction, change the picture of collecting CO2 and water. Use the energy to convert it into a hydrocarbon by first splitting water to hydrogen, and use the hydrogen as a means of reducing the CO2. And so the energy consumer returns the CO2 and the water back into the environment. So you can see air extraction not only as a means of having fossil fuels run a little longer, but afterwards to think of a carbon-based economy without fossil fuels, just like a hydrogen economy would be based on a renewable energy. You could do the same with carbon-based fuels. But you need, of course, the ability to recapture your carbon. So in the end, what I see is that we have to make this much larger picture work, where we not only have the hydrocarbons, but we also have the nuclear and the solar. And I think if those are missing, we have a problem. If all three of those are there, we at least make things work. But we can make them a lot cheaper by driving the energy efficiency, by making biomass energy work wherever it makes sense, to make wind and hydro work to the best of their abilities, and add geothermal into this picture as well. Now with that, I would argue in the long term we have lots and lots of different forms of energy which round out the overall picture. And I think you have your work cut out, because over the next 50 years, the energy infrastructure we have today will have to be replaced with a brand new one, which is far more sophisticated, but I think it will have a lot of different components in it. And I would argue the three big ones, and let me close on that, are solar, nuclear, and fossil with carbon capture and storage. And I thank you for your attention.
I was just sitting here thinking, especially during this panel and during the morning session about emerging technologies and renewables, working in the field that you are all working in, it's an awful lot like being in state government. And I wake up every morning thinking about what Mark Twain must have meant. You must do the same. When he said, "A person who holds a cat by the tail learns things he can learn in no other way." You all have the cat by the tail. But let me frame my remarks to you today in the form of a question, which I think goes to the heart of everything we've been talking about today, not just profit or opportunity or what may be possible, but rather this question. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, we would all agree that if we saw a child about to be struck by a bus, we would run out there and sweep that child away from the path of harm. And yet, we now know that the air quality inside that very same school bus is worse than the air quality outside behind the bus, and we take very little action to correct it. We would agree, I think, that eating mercury in fish is a bad thing, and yet we continue to allow tons and tons of mercury to be pumped into our atmosphere every single day from power plants and from a variety of other sources, which pollutes those fish. We all probably have a will. Maybe some of you younger students here don't, but most of us probably have some kind of a will. We all know who gets the car, the solar panels on the roof, and the velvet paintings of dogs playing poker. But how many of us have thought about the most important legacy of all that we have to pass on to the next generation? And that, of course, are the natural resources that we hold in trust for that generation. You know, the only thing I recall from my study of economics was that economics is unlimited demands chasing limited resources. And fortunately, in my line of work, that's probably all I actually need to know. But the question is not only how we will allocate those limited resources so that our survival today does not diminish or impair the survival of our children tomorrow, but also, do we believe we are our brother's keeper and have an obligation to leave enough for the next guy and the next generation? Now, the American Sign Language symbol for California and for gold are identical, which is interesting, and you might want to try it if you're adventurous. You just fold your two middle fingers down like this, and you put your forefinger next to your cheek, and you just stroke down and fold that last finger down. You just do that. That's the sign for both gold and California. And it's interesting that those two symbols are the same, at least to those of us in state government. But the philosophy of that is rather obvious. It's that our state, our natural resources, are indeed our gold, our most important and valuable resource. There's a legal equivalent to this, which is embodied in our state and federal constitutions. It's called the Public Trust Doctrine, and it says that we have the right to use these natural resources, but not to do so in a way that diminishes their value to others, and indeed to the next generation. So you might say that the Public Trust Doctrine is a formal affirmation that yes, in terms of those resources, we are our brother's keeper, and we do have an obligation to the next generation. But for just a moment, before I go on to talk about how this is all relevant to our topics today, let's take a quick look at some of the gold that's been placed in our care as trustees and see whether or not we're doing a very good job with it. You know, I was in the Madera Irrigation District in the Central Valley a couple months ago, and in their boardroom on the wall, there's a big chart that shows that in 1980, they would drill 70 feet to get fresh water to irrigate the crops. And then as you go year by year, it shows it has to go deeper and deeper until today, they have to drill 140 feet to get fresh water to irrigate their crops. And that's a story that is told and retold all throughout California. We are so overdrafting our aquifers, our valuable natural resources that put water in the bank for us. We're so overdrafting it that we have land subsidence in the Central Valley as much as 70 feet in various places. We can never recover that capacity. So we're not only squandering the resource, we're spending the principal instead of the interest, but we're shrinking the size of the bank. Land. When my fiance's son reaches retirement age in about 2050, the population of California alone will be more than the entire population of the United States when I was born. And one of the impacts in California will be that we will have lost over 1 million acres of valuable farmland by then, and that will cost about $5 billion to the Central Valley economy. And it will cost those communities more than $1 billion a year in 2006 dollars of subsidies to those sprawl communities. In other words, much more than they recoup in property taxes, they will be paying money that has to come somewhere to support those sprawl developments. And let's take a look at air. Air is a particularly interesting metric to figure out how well we've done with it. Because scientists, and there's plenty of you in the room today, they tell me that 98% of the air we breathe is oxygen and nitrogen. We metabolize it, we take it in, we do something with it, we change it. But 1% is inert argon gas. We inhale it, we exhale it, we don't change it in any way. And those scientists also tell me that there's a finite amount of it in the atmosphere, always has been, always will be. So Harvard researchers, as a result of those two facts, tell us that by the age of 20, each of us will have literally inhaled the argon atoms that were exhaled by dinosaurs, by Shakespeare, by Gandhi, and by a Jewish carpenter from Bethlehem. So what do we do with this arguably sacred resource? 100% of the air we breathe in this country is polluted with man-made toxins. And 100,000 people died in this country last year from completely preventable air pollution. And 6.5 million more went to the hospital with respiratory diseases and other ailments that were completely preventable. And most of those were the most vulnerable among us, children and our elders. So when you look at these few metrics, it suggests that we have squandered and are squandering not only our children's future, but the great inheritance that we in this generation received from our parents, and that we haven't in fact been particularly good trustees. And so the question is not really, can these energy sources, this new way of approaching energy issues, technology and conservation, can this fuel California and the rest of the world's future? But rather, because it must, how soon can we do it? And what do we have to do to accomplish it? So it seems to me that when we look at the first part of that equation, is there really enough? And the question was raised by this gentleman before as he posed the issue of there probably isn't, we're going to have to think about nukes. Well, when I jokingly talked about the nuclear plant in the sky, the fact is that enough sunlight falls on the Earth every hour to provide enough power for all of human uses for a year. Now, it would seem to me that we could get some small fraction of that to meet our energy needs. Consider another interesting fact. In the wastewater discharge from Los Angeles County alone, the 2 sewage treatment plants down there, they dump enough treated sewage water into the Pacific Ocean every year, throw it away, or every day rather. There's enough wastewater that they throw away every day that if you extracted the hydrogen from that wastewater, you could power the entire United States transportation fleet from those 2 sewage treatment plants alone. Are there enough renewable resources? You bet there are. And if you add to that the potential that we've seen today of biomass, of geothermal, of tidal, of wind, and other renewables, it seems to me that it's very, very clear that we have enough if we have the technology and the ability to take advantage of it. And of course, energy efficiency is an extremely important part of that equation. Because just 10 years ago, a typical 2 kilowatt system, solar system that you'd put on a residential roof would provide no more than 50% of the typical American home's energy needs. Today it can provide as much as 80%, and that's because of all the more energy efficient appliances and lighting and insulation and other energy efficiency technology. Water is another great area where we've really thought about how to conserve. In Los Angeles County, and I apologize for constantly using Los Angeles analogies, but I'm from there, and so this is an area I know. In the 1980s, we had terrible droughts, and we knew we would have to solve that problem with conservation. So we passed simple ordinances that said when a building changes hands, don't go to any heroic measures today. We don't want you to go out of pocket right now. But when you sell your home or your office building or your multifamily building, at that time, when there's money changing hands, then you better be sure to upgrade your toilets and your showers to low-flow toilets and shower heads and so forth, and a few other very simple conservation measures. And the result is the population of LA County has grown 15% in the last 15 years, and our water use has grown 0% from those very simple measures. And that doesn't even get into what we could be doing if we weren't spending so much potable water on golf courses and landscaping and filling our swimming pools and so on and so forth. So efficiency works, and we can get much more out of existing technology, much of what you've heard about today. To me, one of the most exciting emerging areas, and if I was in the venture capital business, I'd be looking at those technologies that are getting more out of some of these technologies that we're already looking at. For example, solar, making that more efficient. We heard discussion about that today, where you already know there's a market for solar, and what can we do to make that more efficient, to make that generate more power and do so more efficiently. One simple way, I don't know how many of you know Solar Integrated, a company in Los Angeles, John Slangerup. Many of you know John, who went from FedEx to Stewart Energy and now more recently to Solar Integrated. They put flexible solar on industrial roofs, large flat industrial roofs for Coca-Cola, Frito-Lay, Home Depot, and so forth. And when you go to his factory in LA and you look at some of the aerial photographs of some of the buildings that they've done, one of the things you notice is that many of them are only about half to 2/3 covered with his product. And I said, John, what happened to that other third? Why didn't you sell the customer those as well? He said because in many areas, net metering caps don't allow those companies to sell the power back to the grid. And so they don't want to invest in that extra solar capacity when there's nothing they can do with it. So first of all, that gives me a hint as a public policy maker or advisor that that's an area, of course, we know we've got to work on, and we are working on with the IOUs and the other utilities. But the second thing that tells me, John, of course, coming from a background in hydrogen, is that you've got to start connecting the dots. He's talking to many of these companies about going ahead and building out the rest of the solar on their roof while they're doing it, and there's obviously cost efficiencies there, and then using that extra power not to sell back to the grid, but to electrolyze water to make hydrogen to power forklifts in the warehouse, or delivery vans, or vehicles for their employee fleet with central station refueling, and to think about ways to do that. So we can get a lot more out of the existing technologies that are already being deployed, and we've heard much about that today. So if there's enough renewable energy out there, and if there are enough ways to capture that and utilize it, and if there are growing efficiencies in the way that we're going to do it, so what's the problem? I'll tell you what I think the problem is. The problem is not in our technology or in the amount of energy, it's in our mind. It's changing our mindset. We heard today from Dr. Cohn when he posed the question what in his mind was the most important technological breakthrough of the last 100 years, and he cited the transistor. And it made me think, what was the most important mind shift in the last 100 years? And maybe each of you would have your own thought about this, but I think it's John F. Kennedy saying we will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, at a time when emerging technologies offered the promise to do it, but nobody knew for sure how. They were just on that cusp. And it was something that by committing an entire nation to that goal, it galvanized public thinking, it galvanized policymakers, it galvanized industry, it galvanized our research institutions. And lo and behold, we did it. And look at all the fruits of that initial investment. That was a mind shift. That was the kind of thing that got everyone to realize, yes, that incredible goal was possible. And that, to me, is what's missing. The first 100 years of our industrial revolution and our mechanized society, we thought one size fit all. Our electricity, we knew, came from fossil fuels and nuclear power. That was pretty much it. And our transportation fuels come from petroleum. That's pretty much it. And I think the future, we've got to change that thinking. You wouldn't wear the same suit of clothes every day. Well, some of you might. You wouldn't eat the same food every day. You wouldn't go to the same movie or watch the same television show every day. So why is it that we think our transportation or our energy fuels ought to be the same, and the way we get them ought to be the same? That's a mindset that we have to change. We know we can do it. We know that there's abundant numerous renewables that I mentioned before, and lots of ways through distributed generation and other methods to put them in our homes and businesses and institutions. We also know for transportation that the future will really be relying upon a mixture of battery electric and hydrogen and natural gas and biofuels, and thinking about integrated intermodal transportation as well, not just thinking about what's going to power the fleet we have today and imagining the fleet we have today. And that's why I thought the presentation by Semper was so important, because it talked about visioning a future. If you don't vision that future, I mean, if Kennedy had said, I want to start a space program, and, who knows, maybe by the end of the decade we might get to the moon, we wouldn't have been there. It was the fact that he set that goal, It's when the governor of this state, for example, set the greenhouse gas reduction targets or put us on the path of the hydrogen highway. You've got to have that vision. And of course things change along the way. Of course there are course corrections and modifications along the way. But you need that vision. You know, in the Jewish tradition, the shofar is the scribe who writes the Torah, which is the instructions for life. And they write them on parchment, very, very long scrolls of parchment. But they do it with washable ink. And the theory is that you want to be able to wash that ink in the next generation off of the parchment so that the next generation of scribes can write those rules of life in the context of modern life at that time. And it also forces the handing down of those traditions and that learning from one generation to the other. It's not a stale, dusty book or scroll that's on a shelf that people occasionally look at. It becomes an active, living thing. And so in the Jewish tradition, when older people later in life learn new things or new ways of thinking, it's called writing on washed paper. That's what we need to do. We all need to start writing on washed paper. We all need to start thinking about these things in different ways and getting other people to do the same. I know as I say this to you, you're already there. But how can we get others to come along on this most important journey of our survival so that in fact we can answer the question, am I my brother's keeper? Do I have an obligation to not only do well for myself, but leave enough for others and make sure this is a tide that lifts all boats? But that will only happen when we ask ourselves that question. Am I prepared to change the way I think about things? Am I prepared to write on washed paper? And how can I get others to do so? Who will be the first to say that I can do with a little less, that my children will have a little more? Who will be the first to say that my life will not only be measured by the number on the bottom of a balance sheet, but by the balance of clean air and clean landscapes and healthy water that I pass on to my children? Who among us will be the first to take up that call to action and teach it to our children that many of us learned 40 years ago in this country when President Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So I guess I ask you here today on behalf of the governor to take all of these wonderful things that you're working on and don't just work on them in a simple linear fashion where you say, okay, this is my goal today, and as long as I do my part, somehow it will plug into the rest of society, it will plug into the rest of the world. Think about how we're going to change those mindsets, how we're going to change the way we do business in the future. Think about how we can get others to think in these same ways, because everyone's contribution does matter, or everyone's lack of contribution does matter. The vehicle we drive when we leave this parking lot and the emissions that it makes a difference. When we flip the switch, where we get the power, that makes a difference. When we leave the lights on as we walk out of the room instead of turning them off, that makes a difference. Every single one of us can make a difference. Or as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, anyone can be great because anyone can serve. You don't need a college degree. Your verb and your subject need not agree. You only need a heart full of grace. Well, if this is the day we believe that admonition, if this is the day we act upon that admonition, and if this is the day we teach that admonition to the next generation, then this is the day we will truly become our brother's keeper, and the day we will pass the most important legacy of them all to our children. Thank you very much.